In this presentation, I'd like to look at the idea of pedagogic space. In everyday language, we might refer to pedagogic space as teaching and learning space. That is, any site, physical or virtual, in which teaching and learning occurs. An investigation of teaching and learning spaces might include an examination of general architecture, teaching room design, library design, workshops, computer labs. With the emergence of computer technology, learning management systems, wikis, blogs, Twitter, and spaces that are becoming available on mobile phones. The reasons that I've become interested in this topic are that the idea of teaching and learning spaces or pedagogic spaces, as represented by some sort of label, are used in an unproblematic way. This is certainly useful as it identifies the topic of conversation. However, such labels fail to acknowledge the assumptions that underpin the operations of such spaces. What I hope to do in this presentation is to pose some approaches that might be useful in unpacking those assumptions. The paper doesn't tend to be definitive, but more an exploration. It aims to promote discussion. It draws on broad sociological perspectives as well as the ideas of activity theory and Basil Bernstein. Two broad sociological perspectives that can be used to examine the idea of pedagogic or teaching and learning space are the functional and sociocultural perspectives. The functional perspective is consistent with technical scientific assumptions. It looks at the physical, technological, operational and instructional design aspects of a pedagogic space. The limitation of this approach is that it ignores the socio-cultural influences of the actors within the space. Citing Abour, 1996, the meaning derived from a particular teaching learning space is produced out of the cultural, political and economic conflicts, tensions and compromises that organise and disorganise a people. That is, the meanings associated with teaching and learning spaces are constructed. They're contested rather than being neutral. According to DeLeo and Jacobs, 2004, at its most fundamental level, the classroom is simply a place or space. Consideration of classrooms on this level must refrain from ascriptions of value and regard each and every teaching space as a site of pure political and pedagogic possibilities. Actualisation of a classroom's potential is only realisable on the interaction of the classroom space with a set of human participants. That is, it is in the interaction between the spaces and the values, beliefs and histories that people bring to those spaces that meaning is ascribed to the space. The design of the space promotes certain sorts of meanings. It is in the interaction with the participants in this space that the meaning proposed by the developers and designers is recontextualized by the participants themselves. In an early publication on the idea of pedagogic space by Bourman in 1970, he developed a model along three axes to try to describe the sorts of input, process and output that are associated with that teaching and learning space. These three axes are centered around assumptions about whether the curriculum is intended to be task-based or therapeutic, that is, personal development based, whether the approach to teaching is public or private, and whether the outcome of the learning relates to how something occurs or why it occurs. By using the model shown, it's possible to plot different approaches to teaching and learning in terms of public-private, task-therapeutic, learning about and learning how. Whilst consistent with a functionalist perspective, Bourman's approach certainly goes beyond merely looking at the design aspects of a teaching and learning space to look at how that space is used in a pedagogic sense. Whilst useful, Bourman's approach falls short of making the assumptions that underpin the social and cultural nature of a pedagogic or teaching and learning space explicit. It is through the socio-cultural perspective that we can focus on meaning making as well as the power and control relations that are embedded within the teaching and learning space. Activity theory, as proposed by Engstrom, builds on the ideas of Vygotsky. Fundamentally, all learning is mediated by tools or artifacts. This includes the architectural design of the sorts of layouts within the room, the posters, the signs, learning material. Rather than being individual learning, Engestrom's model identifies learning as associated with communities. This second-generation activity theory is often represented by the sort of triangle shown here. And certainly activity theory can be used as a broad heuristic to examine the idea of pedagogic space. However, at an applied level, Mwanza and Engstrom suggest that there are 8 questions that can be used to analyse any pedagogic space according to activity theory. These are: what sort of activity does the space intend to achieve? Why is the activity taking place? Who is involved? What means are being used to perform the activity? Are there any cultural norms, rules or regulations? Who are responsible for what, and are those roles organised? What is the environment in which this activity is being carried out? And what is the desired outcome? My contention here is that through asking these 8 questions, it is possible to begin to unpack the sorts of assumptions that underpin a teaching and learning space. It is also possible to compare sets of pedagogic spaces against the same 8 questions. Whilst it's not possible to discuss the next 3 slides in detail in this presentation, it does show that policy representations of face-to-face delivery, flexible learning, online learning, e-learning and blended learning have changed the notions of subject, tools, objects, rules, community and division of labour within the Australian vocational education and training sector. There are 3 ideas associated with the British sociologist Basil Bernstein that I believe are useful in examining the idea of teaching and learning or pedagogic spaces. These are classification and framing, recognition and realisation rules, and the pedagogic device. It is only the first of these that I will briefly discuss here. In brief, Basil Bernstein's idea of classification relates to the level of insulation between pedagogic spaces or between the actors within a pedagogic space. For example, if the teaching and learning activities that occur in a lecture theatre are entirely discrete from the teaching and learning activities that occur in a laboratory or a workshop, then there is a high level of classification. Alternatively, if there is a high level of integration across these sites, then there is a low level of classification. If we now apply the same idea to a discrete pedagogic space, take for example a wiki. If the relationships between the teacher and the learner are vertically hierarchical, then there is a high level of insulation. If the relationships are more horizontal and the teacher becomes indistinguishable from the students in terms of the activities on the wiki, then there is a low level of classification. Framing relates to the control relations within the pedagogic space, and typically this relates to the control over content, pace, sequence, evaluation and location. Where there is a strong level of teacher control, there is strong framing. Where there is a strong level of student control, there is very weak framing. For example, in a typical lecture setting, there is a high level of framing with teacher control over content, pace, sequence, evaluation of what constitutes legitimate knowledge and the location. In what might be referred to as more progressive forms of education, there is often a higher level of student control over these activities. In these cases, there is a weak level of framing. The slide here shows an analysis of framing across the policy representations of face-to-face learning, flexible delivery and learning, online and e-learning and blended learning in the vocational educational training policy in Australia. And as one can see, the level of framing varies between the various pedagogic spaces as represented in that policy. To conclude, this presentation shows that functionalist models are useful in providing a means to unpack some of the assumptions that are embedded in pedagogic spaces, but these fail to examine broader social concerns such as power and control. This shortcoming is addressed by the sociocultural perspective. In this presentation, I've used the ideas of activity theory and Bernstein's classification to demonstrate how these can be used in a relatively applied way